It is unfortunate that we know so little about the Cretan, or Minoan, civilization, for it has a number of distinctions of considerable significance. It was the first civilization that was not in an alluvial river valley, and, probably as a consequence, it retained its Neolithic garden culture character more than any other. For one thing, it was peaceful, something that can hardly be said about other civilizations. It remained basically matriarchal, in the sense that women had at least social equality, if not social superiority. Its chief deity was female, and women undoubtedly had greater political influence than in any other ancient civilization. Its religion was so unformalized that it had no temples and, so far as our evidence goes, no formal religious ceremonies. And to complete the rather paradoxical picture, its instrument of expansion seems to have been a socialistic state. Yet its people, instead of being oppressed and regimented, had an outlook that was remarkably happy, optimistic, and care-free. The statement that the instrument of expansion of Cretan civilization was a socialistic state is based on the fact that almost all handicraft production, commercial activities, and written records seem to be centered in large public buildings, such as the so-called Palace at Sienosus in Crete. The ruins of this prehistoric Pentagon building were excavated by Sir Arthur Evans after 1900. It is traditional among Angelish archaeologists to call every large building that is excavated either a temple or a palace, and, since Sir Arthur found no evidence of religious ceremonies in this large building, it had to be a palace and its president had to be a king. This king, according to Evans, was the legendary Minos, the Cretan ruler well known in Greek traditions of the historic period. But these traditions seem to indicate that Minos was a title like pharaoh or president, not a personal name, and that the office was, at least in one period, an elective rather than a hereditary one. Homer tells us quite specifically that Minos served for 9 years, so that he could have been a non-hereditary magistrate. This is supported by the evidence from the palace itself, since there is little trace of a personal ruler or of any effort to concentrate power, prestige, or honor about any single individual. Sir Arthur Evans called a small room containing the stone chair the throne room, but the small size both of room and chair make it look rather like a place where someone might sit down in the morning to tie his shoelaces. There is a great deal of art in the palace, but none of it could be interpreted as monarchical. In fact, pictures of individuals, especially males, are rather rare. There are some representations of females dressed in what, even today, would be considered herring costumes, but most of the pictures are of nature in its most beautiful moods. The sea, shot through with sparkling sunlight and enlivened with fish, squid, and other forms of marine life, or lake shores, with flowers and birds, or wildlife in the countryside. Human figures appear occasionally, especially in connection with athletic events, notably with a rodeo-like scene in which youths and maidens vault over the head of a bull by grasping its horns and somersaulting over its head, to land on its back, facing rearward, and hop off. This latter scene is frequently explained as a religious ceremony, and it may well be, but here, as elsewhere, there is no centralization of personality such as would almost inevitably appear in a monarchical regime and which is so obvious in other socialistic civilizations such as the Egyptian, the Indian, or the Russian. The period of mixture of Cretan society goes back almost to the first settlements on the island, and may continue as late as the 3rd millennium. Rough dates could be set from before 3500 BC, perhaps as early as 4000 to after 3000. The elements that came together on this small island of Crete were one, a mixed group from Anatolia who may have been in the Mesolithic cultural stage, with a few early domestic animals and pottery made to look like leather bags, to a Neolithic garden culture of the usual type. The major ingredient in the subsequent Cretan culture. 3. A significant Asiatic influence, possibly associated with the Metallithic diffusion, bringing knowledge of metals, and 4. An Egyptian influence, which is sometimes attributed, without evidence, to refugees from the unification of Egypt by Menes, just before 3000 BC. The last two of these influences continued to float for much of the early portion of Minoan history, so that Cretan art, for example, continued to show Egyptian influences, while Minoan writing, like that of Mesopotamia, was made by impressions on clay tablets. These civilizing influences did not change the basic Neolithic garden foundation of Cretan culture except by building upon it, and the new society remained peaceful and cooperative. The most significant question, which to my knowledge has never been answered or even asked, is how it was possible for a non-alluvial garden culture to adopt the fully sedentary life necessary for civilized existence. In a blunt sentence, why did not the early Minoans exhaust the fertility of the soil and have to shift their fields as their Neolithic ancestors did? The answer probably is that they developed a new diet which put less pressure on soil fertility. This diet was based on olive oil, grape wine, fish, and wheat, and proved so successful that it has remained the staple diet of the Mediterranean area to the present time. It is a very significant diet in a number of ways beyond its biologic adequacy for man. 2 of its elements were liquids, obtained from perennial plantings, while a third was derived from the sea. Oil and wine required sedentary farming and, at the same time, created a demand for pottery containers, which undoubtedly gave an impulse to craft specialization in this direction. In the palace at Cenosus was row after row of man-high pottery jars that had been filled with oil, wine, and wheat. The use of fish for the protein element in their diet served to tie the economy to the sea and provided the water, craft and maritime skills that allowed the Cretans to become the commercial middlemen of the Mediterranean basin when the need arose. And it is possible, although not clear from the evidence, that the grain fields could have been fertilized by products from the sea, such as burned seaweed. At any rate, the Cretan people in their earliest centuries began to work out an economic system that moved them toward cooperation, specialized activities, and dependence on the sea without population pressure on the soil. As in so many civilizations, the period of gestation of Minoan society must rest on inference. The argument that the instrument of expansion was the public authority is itself based on inference, although a fairly obvious one, but we can hardly go behind this inference to any more remote ones about origins. All that we can say is that the cooperative elements of Neolithic peasant agriculture were developed in the political security of an island existence and, probably under the influence of the sea, toward the development of a cooperative, non-monarchical, non-militaristic, and non-ecclesiastical public authority. We do not know if there was only a single such authority for the whole island or several of them. The archaeological evidence shows several centers in which urban centralized living developed on the island, at Cenosuits and Madia in the north and at Phaistos and Hagia Triada in the south. The existence of palaces in all of these does not necessarily indicate separate political units. Yes, only if these buildings were administrative centers, as we have suggested. There is a basic pattern in them all, and the later ones may merely be decentralized administrative centers constructed by one political system. It has been suggested, largely because of the existence of a hard surface road across the island from Phaistos to Cenosuits, that these two were merely seasonal residences for the same ruler. None of this kind of supposition gets us very far. The only established facts are that these various centers were fortified and clearly lived in peaceful relationships, and that the whole island, by the second millennium, was a single political unit. Since this political unity was achieved without clear evidence of warfare, it is possible that it grew up in the early periods of Minoan history. The lack of fortifications would also indicate that the island had a unified control of the sea and thus could protect itself against enemies from outside. By 2300 BC, after 1,000 years of existence, Cretan society was launched on a brilliant period of commercial expansion, cultural progress, and artistic accomplishment. It had a system of numbers and writing that is still beyond our ability to understand and may remain so, especially if the language used was an unknown Asian language, as seems possible. We know about 100 words in the language, many of them place names or names of objects used by later Greeks, but these do not seem to be related to any known languages. Words ending in imdh, like Corinth, hyacinth, plinth, and labyrinth, or words ending in assh, like the Greek word for sea, thalassa, were originally miles. Known. The writing, which was probably originally ideographic and rather pictographic, became increasingly linear, changing by jumps rather than by gradual development, as might be expected under a centralized political system. The commercial prosperity of Crete continued to grow in the first half of the second millennium and was benefited rather than harmed by the Bronze Age invasions. These intrusions did not reach Crete itself, and the disturbances of the Hurrians in the Levant and the Hyksos in Egypt made it possible for Crete to expand its economic life by adding craft activities to its commercial functions. Its produce, including such objects as pottery, bronze weapons, engraved gems, and jewelry, were in great demand. The prosperity of the Bohemian Bronze Age and the growing trade of the Canaanite cities of Syria created new opportunities for Cretan traders. The palaces at various points were rebuilt on a more elaborate scale, especially at Cenosus and Phaistos. These two cities, 40 miles apart, were joined by a highway of paved cobblestones provided with bridges. At the Cenosus end of this road stood an elaborate building, probably a hotel, offering all the conveniences necessary to the weary traveler, including baths and dinner in a beautiful large hall decorated with realistic frescoes of game birds. At Cenosus itself the palace was a low, flat-topped structure covering about 5 acres. It had a system of baths and drains, flushed with water from rain tanks on the roofs. The naturalistic mural paintings were infused with nature, the open air, sunshine, and happiness. None showed warfare or death, religion, darkness, power, or majesty as were commonly shown on the paintings of the other early civilizations. The fertility goddess was still worshipped, but the idea of her was quite changed. Gone was the pregnant Earth Mother, replaced by a glamorous female, slim and straight, attired in a modish dress with a low-cut neckline, a tight bodice, and a long, full skirt with many flounces. Her hair, piled in curls on her head, was fastened by gold pins. Even serious French books called her La Parisienne. This Cretan goddess was associated with snakes, birds, pillars, sacred trees, and the symbols of a double axe. These symbols came from Asia but were given an additional lightness and elegance in Crete. The double axe symbol was marked plentifully on the walls of the palace. The building itself was called labyrinth in the Minoan language, an expression which meant house of the double axe. With its numerous rooms and long corridors on various levels, this building seemed like a maze to the naive Greek-speaking barbarians when they first saw it, since they were probably familiar with no house of more than 2 rooms. They took the word labyrinth to mean a maze where one became lost. We still use the word in this sense today. Beyond the labyrinth was the city, a center of 2- and 3-story rectangular houses, providing every evidence of a prosperous, happy, secular free society. This society, in the course of the second millennium, found its growth arrested by the slowing up of its rate of expansion. It is very difficult for us to distinguish with any confidence the middle stages in the evolution of Minoan civilization. Our natural ignorance of the history of a society unknown through written evidence is intensified by the ambiguities to be expected in a civilization whose instrument of expansion was a socialist state. Of the general characteristics of the age of conflict, such as decreasing expansion, imperialist wars, class conflicts, and irrationality, we know almost nothing. There may have been class disturbances or even intra-urban wars, but the evidence does not allow us to say so with any assurance. Just before the middle of the second millennium, layers of ashes indicate severe fires in most Cretan urban centers, but we cannot be sure if these resulted from class disturbances or war, or from foreign invasions or even from earthquakes. The possibility of these fires coming from earthquakes seems to be reduced by the fact that fortifications and a sharp rise in the occurrence of weapons seems to have appeared briefly in the Middle Minoan period. Moreover, a couple of centuries later, the style of writing made one of its periodic changes in Cianosuits, adopting a form known as lineal B, which we now know was used to write the Greek language. As Cianosuits was not exact at that time, although it was somewhat later, about 1430 BC, we do not believe that these Greek speakers came in as invaders, but rather that they migrated in peace, fully, perhaps by serving as workers or mercenary marines for the Cretan state. The reconstruction of the history of the Aegean area during the second millennium from the archaeological evidence on the island of Crete and also on the mainland of Greece, especially in Argos, can't be made with a certain degree of confidence. The Bronze Age invaders who came down into the Balkans from the north during the first half of the second millennium were the first Greek-speaking persons to enter the area. We call them the Achaeans. On the whole, they probably came in small bands or even as isolated warriors in a peaceful way, with no desire to destroy the growing trade over the routes from Crete to the Central European Bronze Age. By military prowess and by marriage with the daughters of the matrilineal natives and Cretan colonists, these Greeks gradually established control over the area and over the commercial routes. Although the trade continued, the Achaeans extorted tribute from it and were able to use this wealth to build a barbaric, semi-civilized Cretan, Achaean society. This mixed culture is generally known as Mycenaean, after its chief city at the head of the Gulf of Argos. Elsewhere, as at Athens to the northeast, the Cretans either retained or re-established control and were themselves in a position to demand tribute. In any case, for some time the modus vivendi existed in which both peoples could enjoy the expanding commerce. In this process the Achaeans became Cretanized and are called Mycenaeans. They seem to have gradually adopted the Cretan diet by replacing meat and animal products with the fruit of the vine, the olive tree, and the sea. They adopted the use of stone buildings and more naturalistic paintings, but the buildings were fortresses and the pictures were of war, hunting, races, or other violent scenes. They largely shifted from cremation to burial of the dead, but they kept their ears, their patriarchal social patterns, and the loose, pinned clothing of flatland pastoralists rather than the fitted, button clothing of Crete. By 1450 this mixed Mycenaean culture covered much of Greece and had become, at least socially, the dominant element in Cenosus. The political structure seems to have been one of autonomous feudal princes surrounded by their war-loving retainers, the whole under the nominal overlordship of Mycenae and supporting a life of luxury, idleness, and warlike adventure by the tribute imposed on Cretan commerce. The political relationship of Mycenae with Crete and a role of Cenosus are ambiguous. The mainland city may have functioned as an undependable ally, or it may have already taken over political power in Cenosus by peaceful means, either through slow immigration or by marriage into the commercial oligarchy of the country. By 1430 some Mycenaeans were no longer satisfied with their role. Taking advantage of political difficulties that Mycenaeans encountered in Sicily, and using their recently acquired knowledge of seafaring, some of the Greek speakers arose in revolt, sacked Cenosus, and permanently moved the center of Minoan civilization to the mainland. The next period is accordingly known as the Mycenaean Age, 1430 to 1150 BC, and represents the age of decay of Minoan society. The Mycenaean peoples could sack and destroy, but they could not organize or control the complicated Minoan economic structure. This structure, based on commerce, required security and order along its trade routes, or it could not function. Such security had been provided on the sea by the Minoan fleet, but now the unruly Mycenaean warriors began to seize rather than to nurture commerce. As piracy rose, trade declined. On land, the long trade route from Argos to Central Europe had been maintained because of recognition of mutual benefits and, above all, by realization that small demands for tribute would provide income for an indefinite period, while total seizure of goods would kill the activities once for all. Although Cretan craftsmen continued for a long time to turn out work of high quality, the themes of this art became increasingly violent, turning from sun-drenched nature to scenes of war and the hunt. In time, artistic techniques declined, realism being replaced by heraldic beasts and geometric designs. The system was increasingly supported by piracy, plunder, and imposed tribute. Having crippled one great trade route to the north by the destruction of Cenosus about 1430, the Mycenaeans could hardly permit the rival route to continue, and about 1184 they captured and sacked the second great commercial city of the Aegean, Troy. This city, of Anatolian rather than Aegean culture, existed from early in the 3rd millennium, and its many levels of occupation give the archaeologist a dramatic picture of its mutu out history. Its greatest city, the second on the site, had been destroyed by the Hittite invaders about 1900. Its sixth city, a relatively prosperous town, was destroyed by an earthquake about 1365. It was rebuilt almost immediately but was sacked, as described in Homer's Iliad, by the Greeks in the 12th century. This event marked the end of the Great Bronze Age archaic cultures everywhere in the West. Shortly afterward, the Iron Age invaders, the Dorians, Phrygians, Carolins, and Lydians, poured out from the Upper Balkans and wiped out the Trojan, Hittite, and Mycenaean cultures together. A Dark Ages descended on the whole area west of the Levant for almost 2 centuries, 1100 to 900 BC. The process by which civilization, as an abstract entity distinct from the societies in which it is embodied, dies or is reborn, is a very significant one. There are at least 5 steps in the process. Civilizations die as one: decreasing political security and the ending of law and order make property precarious and make personal violence an increasingly significant element in life. Accordingly, long-distance trade decreases. As a result, town life becomes precarious and there is a general exodus from the towns as people try to find a place in which they can be attached in some stable social and economic relationship to the food-producing earth. Obviously, for there is a decline and even a disappearance of the middle classes of property-owning, commercial, literate, city-dwelling group, and 5. Illiteracy rises rapidly. Civilization reappears through the same 5 steps, each in reverse. 1. Law and order are re-established. 2. Commerce increases. 3. Cities appear and grow. 4. The middle class, between soil tillers and fighting men, reappears. And 5. Literacy reappears as a technique of record-keeping and distant communication for the middle class. This process has passed through these steps several times, 2 of them at the 2 extremities of the life of classical civilization. This civilization, as is well known, had 8 dark ages at each end. The first, about 1100 to 900 BC, marked the division between Cretan civilization and classical culture, and the second, about AD 700 to 950, marked the division between classical civilization and Western. Each Dark Age is the period between the 5-step fall and the 5-step rise of civilization of which we speak. In the earlier of the two, the political disorder that initiated the 5-step sequence is associated with the Mycenaean exploitation and the Dorian invasions. Then, generations later, law and order were re-established in the Mediterranean by the activities of the Phoenicians, and the 5-stage sequence continued until classical culture was established. The Second Dark Ages, at the end of classical culture, was initiated by the political insecurity associated with the Germanic invasions and the fall of Roman political power in the West. AD 476 it was ended, and Western civilization begun, by the same 5-step sequence beginning about AD 970. The Iron Age invasions on both sides of the Aegean Sea established the basis on which the subsequent classical civilization was to rise. In the Balkans itself, the invaders' Dorians came only a short distance from the north, but they came with such force and such destructive violence that the great mass of them ended up in southern Greece and in Crete itself. Thus in the classical period these were Doric, speaking areas and still retained the crudities of their ancestors. The chief state and leader of this group came to be Sparta. On the other hand, the Dorians drove southward so rapidly that they did not turn eastward into the islands and peninsulas of eastern Greece, and large enclaves of Mycenaean, that is mixed Achaean Cretan culture persisted. In the classical period these survivals are known as Ionian, and became the highest representatives of later Greek culture, undoubtedly because of the survival of elements of Cretan culture. Some Mycenaeans, driven from their homes in Greece by the Dorian advance, crossed the Aegean and settled on the middle shores of the western coast of Anatolia, Asia Minor. These are also called Ionians, and the shore on which they settled is known as Ionia. Thus, closely related Ionian peoples, with a similar culture and common dialect, lived on both the eastern and western shores of the Middle Aegean Sea after 1000 BC. It was among these people, possessing strong elements of Minoan culture, that the new classical civilization was born. This culture was passed on to the later society, not only by surviving vestiges of social customs and personal outlook, but more explicitly through the works of Homer. These works, written in Ionia after the Dorian invasions, are based on memories of the great deeds of the Cretanized Achaeans before the invasions.